infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, inside the hot zone, a soldier on the front lines of biological warfare. If you have an interest in the edge of your seat stories of some of the world's most dangerous pathogens, this is the book for you. And joining me today is the author of the book, Dr. Mark Kortepeter. Dr. Kortepeter, thanks for joining me this evening to talk inside the hot zone.
Great to be here. Thanks, Robert.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and just start out. If you can give the audience a little background on yourself. Introduce yourself. What's your story?
So I'm a physician scientist. My training is in infectious diseases and public health. And I'm currently a professor of epidemiology at the University of Nebraska College of Public Health. And I run what's called the Special Pathogens Research Network. We have 10 sites around the country in the national disaster regions for collaborating on research if there is ever need for an emerging infectious disease outbreak. I'm also a retired Army colonel. I spent 27 years in the Army. And I gained an interest in tropical disease early on in my career when I did my training in Hawaii for my medicine training. And then over time, my interest has gradually been more focused, originally in biodefense after I was assigned to the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, and eventually has even gotten more narrow into the field of biohemorrhagic fevers for disease like Ebola.
Okay, so Dr. Kortepeter, what is the hot zone and why this book? Well,
the term hot is something that's been used for decades to describe, high level threat viruses, and the term, sort of like it's too hot to handle, right? The hot zone is kind of a general term for an area of contamination or an area of risk, but the term the hot zone was actually popularized by the best-selling book, The Hot Zone by Richard Preston, and that book's about the discovery of Ebola virus. Now, my book, it's called Inside the Hot Zone. And I should say the term the hot zone often we often refer to our institute, USAMRIID, as the hot zone, colloquially. And so that's where I get the name of the book. So it's really an insider's look at this institute, USAMRIID, and some of the crises I dealt with there. And I thought, when I started thinking about writing a book, there's been a number of people who've written about USAMRIID, and I thought it was, most of those people are reporters, and I thought it was time for someone actually who worked there, who was really on the front lines, who lived the experiences, to write about them. So that's why, that's kind of what the book's about. And when I was thinking about writing this book, I thought about my career essentially has been a real life medical thriller. I've had a lot of exciting experiences and scary experiences, and I thought it was a great opportunity to share them. I also thought it would be a nice opportunity to shine a light on USAMRIID and the importance of USAMRIID to the national defense, and also the people there who work, kind of the unsung heroes who kind of put their lives on the line defending the nation. So those are kind of the reasons I decided to write the book.
Yeah. So what is and where is Fort Detrick?
Well, Fort Detrick is an Army post in Maryland. It's about 30 miles northwest of the nation's capital. And it was originally called Camp Detrick when it was established, I think, in the 40s. It was originally a National Guard, Air National Guard base. And but over time, eventually it got large enough to be called a fort, and it was the headquarters of the Army's bioweapons development program, which ran from the 40s all the way to 1969 when the offensive program was closed. And now is essentially a headquarters for national biodefense. Not only is USAMRIID there, but also other organizations like the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease has a biodefense facility there called the Integrated Research Facility. The Navy also has a lab there next to USAMRIID, and there's also a forensic lab called the NBAC, which is run by Homeland Security. So that really is a national biodefense campus now. And the other part of the campus that was established when the offensive program was closed in 1969 is the National Cancer Institute. That's a big part of Fort Detrick as well now.
Oh, okay. Can you give the audience a snapshot of what is USAMRIID?
So USAMRIID is the largest, to my knowledge, the largest biodefense institute in the world. It has specialized containment laboratories to allow the safe studying of threat agents ranging from, things like anthrax to Ebola. So there's these laboratories. I think maybe we can talk later about the different biosafety levels, but they have a range of biosafety levels they can work at safely in this laboratory. And the mission really is to develop diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines against some of these high threat agents.
Now, one of the more interesting chapters, well, at least the way you titled it, was concerning the 6 Chessmen of Doom, and you describe a half a dozen different pathogens, and you correlate them to different pieces on the chess board. Dr. Kortepeter, can you explain what these pathogens are, and why do you tag them to these different chess pieces?
So there are 6 pathogens that are deemed the Category A threat agents, and the CDC is the one who labeled these as Category A. So these are the agents when they got around and got a bunch of smart people together and decided these are the ones that are the highest threat to public health, risk of causing panic, and also those agents needing some of the most development of countermeasures at the time. And so they are things like anthrax, smallpox, plague, tularemia, botulism, and viral hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola, Lassa, and Marburg. So I as I was writing the book, I wanted a way to make these a little more personal for people, so kind of bring it to their level where they would also have an easier way to sort of understand it and have a better picture of these, sort of to try to sort of give a face and a name to these threat agents. So I came upon this idea of the chess pieces or the chessmen. So let me give you an example. So viral hemorrhagic fever. So I called the VHFs the knights. If you think about it on a chessboard, a knight is causes a little bit of a surprise attack because it doesn't move in a straight line or a diagonal line. It moves up 2 pieces and over 1, or it moves up 1 and over 2. And so the knights can be a little tricky. They can kind of jump over the pawns and get the king or the queen in a bit of surprise. And so I use that analogy for them because diseases like Ebola and Marburg tend to be quiet for a while, and then suddenly out of nowhere they cause these surprise attacks, making lots of people sick and causing, sort of these outbreaks that try to cook along for a while, and then suddenly there they are. So that's the knights, or VHS. For botulism, I'll give you just a couple of these. So botulism, I call it the pawn because, much like the pawns or serfs of the old days in the Middle Ages, they were essentially tilling the soil, kind of low level in society. And the organism which causes botulism is Clostridium botulinum, and actually it is found in the soil. The other thing about the pawn is that the pawn has to be very close to the opposing piece to attack it and destroy it. So the pawn has to be right next door to the king or the queen or any other piece. And so with botulism or botulinum toxin, it doesn't spread downwind to the great degree that other the agents do, like tularemia or anthrax. And so I thought, it's kind of a weapon of assassination. And so that seemed to fit well with the way the pawn moves on the chessboard. Mm-hmm. And then I'll just say anthrax, I call it the queen because, the queen is really the lead piece on the board in terms of being the most dangerous. And I thought, because the queen can move in any direction and go long distances, very much like anthrax. When anthrax is in the spore form, it can spread downwind multiple kilometers, tens of kilometers, and actually kill and make people ill for great distances. And so I thought that's why. And then anthrax is one of these organisms that, in some ways, it's kind of like the ideal weapon. It can be grown up in large quantities, and when it's in the spore form, it can last for decades and survives well in the air. So I thought it was apt to be named the queen.
Okay. So you mentioned that anthrax is the ideal weapon. Is that your opinion, or what? I mean, do you actually consider that of all the agents that's the most ideal weapon out there?
Well, I think it depends. It depends, of course, what the perpetrator is interested in. But I think certainly that's one of our concerns, that the anthrax has a lot of the properties that we think of that make a so-called, a quote-unquote good bioweapon agent. Yeah. Things like it can be grown up in large quantities. It's very stable in the air. It's very stable for storage. It can, infect lots of people. It doesn't actually, unlike some of the other agents like tularemia, it requires a lot of organisms. We think, 10 to 15,000 organisms to actually infect. So that's probably one of the properties that's not as good for that. But it doesn't take very much to actually still, if someone has a concentration in the air, it's not that hard to inhale that much. But it doesn't, unlike tularemia, which just has, maybe 10 to 100 organisms to actually infect.
Right. I want to talk a little bit more about the work at USAMRIID, and clearly there's a lot of special precautions that go on there. If you could touch on some of these special precautions, and also the acronym that's BSL, and we hear about that in the news occasionally. But what does that mean to the layperson?
So BSL stands for biosafety level, and this is a term that's used by the CDC and NIH in terms of describing different levels of protection, and procedures that go on in laboratories to protect the people working in the laboratory. So if you think about it, it's kind of like going to the airport, and this is kind of the analogy I use in the book, that, when you go to the airport, you have multiple different levels. You certainly, anybody can walk into the airport, but then in order to get, into the, at least before you even get to security, you have to sort of show your boarding pass, and then you go through security where you have to go through and get the x-ray and things like that. So similarly, in the laboratory, there are multiple different levels you have to go depending on what you're working on. So I think about biosafety level 1. There are 4 levels, 1 through 4. Biosafety level 1 is, think about a high school laboratory where you're really not working with pathogenic agents. It's going to make anybody sick. So there's really not too many procedures you have to do. Maybe just wash your hands after you work with whatever it is. And biosafety level 2, which is the most common that you'll see in most microbiology labs in hospitals. Right. There are certain procedures required. You can't go in, smoke or eat in the laboratory. You have to. Usually you don't work in an open bench with organisms. You work in a biosafety cabinet. You wear gloves. You wear a white coat, a lab coat. And then when you leave, you have to wash your hands. But you're not working with agents usually that can infect you through the air. So you work with things like Salmonella, E. coli, staph. And then biosafety level 3 is where we start talking about containment. So this is where the organisms are known to potentially infect laboratorians through the air. But one thing that distinguishes this from level 4 is that usually there's a vaccine or a treatment for those specific organisms. But they can be potentially deadly. So I think about things like tularemia, anthrax, if it's grown up in quantities. So these are diseases for which we either have a treatment or a vaccine. And then there are special requirements not only with, just wearing gloves and gowns and things like that. In some cases, you may have to wear a respirator or a special mask, a HEPA filter mask to try to prevent infection. And then in some cases, you may have to take a shower when you leave the laboratory. And usually on the way in, you have to take all your street clothes off, put on scrubs, things like that. So the procedure is a little more stringent than what you get with BSL-2. And then finally, BSL-4 or maximum containment is where for those deadly organisms for which you have no treatments or vaccines, and which are also known to potentially infect laboratories through the air. So this is where, at this level, we essentially try to separate completely the person from the organism. So you can do that in two ways. You could put the organism inside a container, which is called a glove box or class 3 cabinet, or you could put the person inside a container or what we call a spacesuit. So this is where you see the pictures of people wearing these spacesuits in the laboratory. And so this is for things like Ebola, Marburg, Lassa, some of these hemorrhagic fever viruses.
So USAMRIID is a BSL-4 lab.
Well, no, they have BSL-2 through 4. So they have a lot of BSL-2 labs. They have about 40,000 square feet of BSL-3 labs and 10,000 square feet of BSL-4 labs.
Okay.
So it's, at one point it was the largest BSL-3 and 4 labs in the country. I don't know if it still is, but there is a new building being built which will be the largest in the world, actually.
Now, you talk about some other things unique to USAMRIID, and one of the things is the slammer. Can you tell the audience what the slammer is?
Sure. The term the slammer sort of makes it sound like it's jail, but what it is it's a facility that's within USAMRIID that was designed as an intensive care unit, but it has all the trappings of a biosafety level 4 lab. So the care providers could wear the same spacesuits that are worn in the BSL-4 lab. There was an autoclave within the slammer for decontaminating items leaving the lab. Excuse me. There was a thing called steam sterilization of any liquid waste, and on the way out, the care providers would go through a decontamination shower, the same type of shower that was in the biosafety level 4. So it's actually built in the era of the Apollo moon rockets landings to handle patients with anything, even something from an extraterrestrial organism. So it was built in sort of this era of the Andromeda strain. But that's what the slammer is. It was closed in 2011, but it was the first facility of its kind, so-called biocontainment unit, and actually it served as the model for the other biocontainment units that I work with now across the country in these 10 regions.
Oh, okay. So it's similar to what they have at like Emory in Nebraska and NIH and all that?
It's similar. Actually, I would say it's the gold standard. It's even one level higher than those.
Oh, okay.
In terms of what it could do. So you think about, it's more like the BSL-4. BSL-4 is a laboratory designation. So there's no real clinical designation like that, but it's akin to a BSL-4 lab, whereas the other institutions like Emory, University of Nebraska, NIH's facility, they are more like a BSL-3 plus situation. They don't have the blue suits. They don't have the inline air for the suits. They don't have decontamination showers, things like that.
Yeah. And you do have a set of pictures in the book, which are kind of neat to look at. And one thing is called the 8-ball. What's the 8-ball?
So the 8-ball is it's a 1 million liter stainless steel sphere that is on Fort Detrick. It's still there. It's actually on the National Registry of Historic Sites now. But it was built during the, I think it's like 1950s, as a way to test infections with these pathogens in a controlled manner, in a very scientific manner. So what they would do is they could release an aerosol and then mix it to uniform concentration in this huge sphere. It's sort of like if you look at it, it kind of looks like a spaceship hovering over the ground, like 3 stories up. But it was a way so that they could test the aerosol infectivity of different pathogens with either animals or humans. Actually, there was a program called the White Coat Program, where Seventh-day Adventists wanted to serve their country, but they didn't want to bear arms, so they volunteered to be research volunteers in these studies. And what they would do is that there's portals around it's sort of like if you think about Saturn, you have the ring around Saturn. So there's a central ring around the 8-ball, where there were portals where someone would put their face up to a mask, and then once the concentration of the aerosol is uniform, then the valve would be opened and they could inhale the organism for a period of time, and then the concentration of exactly how many organisms they inhaled could be evaluated, and then they could understand a little bit about infectivity of these organisms and incubation periods based on numbers of organisms, things like that. And then the volunteers were then subsequently monitored on a hospital in Fort Detrick, and if they started becoming ill, then they'd be treated immediately. So it was a very sophisticated program at the time, the White Coat Program, and the informed consent actually that was done too. So was pretty much ahead of its time. So the volunteers, before they did any experiments, they would actually sign informed consent, and then they would be treated. And to my knowledge, nobody ever. Some of them became ill from the experiments, but none of them died.
Now, you kind of mentioned a little bit earlier that USAMRIID does some work in the field of countermeasures. What are we talking? Vaccines, antitoxins, and the like?
Correct. So we usually think about vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics. So when you say antitoxins, that would be one type of treatment for a toxin.
Okay. And in the book, there's a number of chapters, and you're going over all these different stories, very interesting, unique stories of things that have happened at USAMRIID or related to USAMRIID or biological agents. So I want to switch gears to some of these stories without giving away your whole book. And let's start with the pawn. Nearly 20 years ago, you received a call. What happened?
It was I can't remember what night. It was a Thursday night, I think, in October 2001. And so we were already knee-deep in anthrax. And although the anthrax outbreak was starting to die down at that time in terms of what we were doing, but it was, shortly after 9/11, so it was a pretty scary time. Mm-hmm. And I was at home one night at my desk, and I get a call around 9 o'clock, and the deputy commander says to me, you need to pack and ship 100 doses of antitoxin to Japan for a botulinum toxin. I said, excuse me? I didn't say that I thought that, but I immediately knew something bad was happening. I'd actually gotten a couple calls earlier from him asking how many doses do we have on hand. So I knew something was up even before I got that call. About packing and shipping, but I knew, this was definitely a disaster. I didn't know what was going on. And USAMRIID has a special cache of vaccines and treatments that are investigational, so they have to be given with informed consent. And they've used them for decades for, the vaccines for the laboratory workers who work with these special agents. And then they had developed some specialized antitoxins against botulinum toxin as a result of fears during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, that, there's certain botulinum toxin. There's actually 8 different serotypes of botulinum toxin, and the common ones are A, B, and E. But they're actually, so there were only antitoxins against those 3, but then the concern was, well, if someone's got an antitoxin to the common ones, the enemy out there, in this case, it was Iraq, might decide to develop one of the other toxins against one of the other serotypes. So there was a movement to a program to develop antitoxins against all these, and we had an antitoxin against, at the time, 7 toxins. So, so that was what my mission was, to go back up to Fort Detrick and essentially pack and ship 100 doses. And actually, it got worse, because as we were doing this, I got another call that said, up the number of doses to 150. So I knew this was getting worse by the minute. So anyway, we spent the whole night. I called in a couple people, one who was a specialist in packing and shipping these types of products across the world, because you don't want to lose your cold temperatures while it's in shipment. And so, yeah, we spent the night and had a police escort early in the morning down to Andrews Air Force Base, where a plane was waiting for us. Anyway, the bottom line was that we were concerned that the president had been exposed to botulinum toxin just before he left to Japan, left to Shanghai for a business meeting with the Chinese. So it was a pretty scary event, and fortunately everything worked out well in the end. And we did get the antitoxin down to Andrews Air Force Base, but then we didn't actually end up having to ship it.
Well, no stress there, huh?
Yeah. Well, it is kind of, you think about that. Here you are in this, it was me and my colleague, Judy Pace, in my office, just looking at each other and saying, oh my God, the president's been slimed with bot, and it's you and me who are going to save his life. It's pretty daunting to think you have something like that on your shoulders.
Yeah, no doubt. Somebody whose name was in the news not that long ago on a pretty regular basis was Dr. Bruce Ivins, and he is linked to USAMRIID. Dr. Kortepeter, what can you tell us about him as a scientist, and can you talk about his story at all?
Sure. I do have a couple chapters about him and the accusations by the FBI, and really in the book what I try to show is that there's another side to the story about Dr. Ivins that from his colleagues who worked with him, and I try to let them speak for themselves about Bruce. I didn't know Bruce that well, but I certainly did know him. But he's a talented bacteriologist, so he worked on things like anthrax and plague and other bacteria. I think he's most noted for his work on the, antibiotics treatments and prophylaxis against anthrax, and trying to understand, efficacy of vaccines against anthrax and what constitutes protective amounts of antibodies from someone who's been vaccinated. And he also was one of the inventors of a new vaccine called new anthrax vaccine called the recombinant protective antigen vaccine, which is protective antigen is a protein that's secreted by anthrax as a common binding component for some of the toxins that cause the lethality of anthrax. So he was one of the inventors of that vaccine, and he also had studies on the pathogenesis of anthrax infection. So he did a lot of different things related to anthrax, and he worked at USAMRIID for 18 years.
Okay, and if listeners want to read more about that, I encourage you to check out the book. I will link to it in the show notes part of the when I publish the podcast. Dr. Kortepeter, Ebola, of course, constantly in the news these days. Any stories linked to USAMRIID concerning Ebola during your time there?
Well, there's lots of stories linked to USAMRIID and Ebola. I should say that, USAMRIID has been at the forefront of Ebola and other viral hemorrhagic fever research for decades. And in fact, one of the things is pretty much any vaccine or treatment that has been used, including the ones that are being used over in East Africa currently, had some work done at USAMRIID, either animal studies done or some of the development of these products. And so it's, essentially without the early work done for the last several decades at USAMRIID, we probably wouldn't be where we are today in terms of the countermeasures for Ebola. But I think you're probably interested in some of the scary stories I tell. So when I was a brand spanking new, actually no, this is 2004. It was near the end of my first tour at USAMRIID. I was the medicine division chief, which means I ran sort of this program to give specialized vaccines to our researchers, and also we respond to any of the emergencies in the laboratory related to potential exposures to some of the threat agents. And so I got one afternoon I was walking down the hallway, and one of the virologists who rushed us into our clinic and said, "We have an Ebola exposure in the laboratory." And of course, that certainly makes your stomach drop to the floor.
Sure.
And you start, feel like someone punched you in the gut. And so this led to cascade of events, but it really was probably the most serious exposure I dealt with in my time at USAMRIID. And even though I was used to, was used to dealing with other things routinely, but this is probably one of the scariest things I ever had to deal with. So the individual, the scientist, had been working with infected mice that had been infected with the most deadly strain of species of Ebola called Ebola Zaire. And when she was injecting an antibody preparation into the peritoneal cavity on some of the mice, and then she was on the fifth mouse in a row with the same needle and syringe, and as she was going to inject the mouse kicked her and kicked the needle, and essentially it knocked her off her normal trajectory, and it went and grazed her, sort of the fleshy part of her thumb. And so it was very serious exposure. The exposures from Africa, where someone has a needle stick, were, at that time, we knew of, were 100% fatal. So we basically figured she was going to die. Mm-hmm. And so I was in charge of the event as the chief of medicine, and a lot of my people worked in the slammer. So we did put her in the slammer, and a lot of my people were taking care of her. And one of my colleagues, Jim Martin, volunteered to be here attending physician, and I was on the outside dealing with all the other things that were happening, trying to work with the Food and Drug Administration, because we really had nothing at the time, unlike today. So nothing had actually really worked in animals. But there were two products that we had some, thought maybe these are potential, so we had to work with the FDA to potentially give them to her if we needed them. I had to deal with the Pentagon because we were getting fire from the Pentagon, of course, what we call heat rounds were coming in, and then just media queries and just running the whole event. It was quite an event, and that's something I hope I don't have to live through again.
Now, Dr. Kortepeter, do you have a favorite chapter in this book, and why is it your favorite chapter?
I think my favorite chapter probably is the bot chapter, because it really, as I mentioned, it's not very often where you get to essentially hold the fate of the president in your hands. So, whether the president might live or die. So I think that's one of them. The other one would probably be the one where I'm on this specialized biodefense team that went to the desert in 2003 to array different countermeasures against threat agents that we were concerned that Iraq and Saddam Hussein might deploy against our troops. So essentially, I'd been teaching about biodefense. I ran a department in the lab, and I'd run a health department, so I was very well versed in a lot of stuff, and I'd actually been deployed before to Bosnia as the chief of preventive medicine. So this deployment really culminated in bringing everything together that I knew as a physician, a soldier, a biodefender, and I was placed on the front lines, essentially, in a war environment, protecting our soldiers in battle. And that was so, essentially, it was like, I call it my midterm exam for my career, because my career in the military went on for another 10 years, but it was certainly a big test of, some of my knowledge and scientific skills, and just my being a soldier as well. So I think that's probably my second favorite chapter.
All right. Any final thoughts on the book, your tenure at USAMRIID, or anything like that?
I think it's been an honor and privilege, I think, to work with my colleagues who have been really on the front lines with me in terms of national biodefense. I think, even though the stories in the book, in those stories, I'm the continuity throughout the book to move the chapters forward. But I hope anybody who reads it comes away with appreciation for the other unsung heroes in the Institute who really do work in the nation's defense every day and put their lives on the line. And I think the other thing I'll conclude with, just to say that there's a lot that USAMRIID has done behind the scenes in national defense. People don't really know. I mentioned already Ebola, but if you think back to the 2001 anthrax attacks, USAMRIID really was the foundation for the knowledge of anthrax in this country and the countermeasures, things like that. If we hadn't had the work done there prior to 2001, we wouldn't have known what's the best way to treat people. We wouldn't have known, does the vaccine work after exposure, things like that. So it's really, it's a core facility in the national defense that I think many people don't understand. So here again, as I said early on, I'm hoping my book does shed light on some of the important aspects of USAMRIID as the nation's kind of, like I like to say, it's like the nation's biodefense hotline, ready to drop things, whatever's going on in terms of the research to help in the operations to defend the nation.
And you can find the book on Amazon and other booksellers, I take it?
Yeah, it's on Amazon. It's on BarnesandNoble.com. It's actually in Barnes and Noble stores right now. I've seen it certainly, and there's a way on Barnes and Noble to check if it's in specific stores, but I've seen it certainly in the national capital area and some of the major metropolitan centers around the country. And then you can also find it on the Potomac Books website, Potomac Books is the publisher.
Okay, excellent. And the book again is Inside the Hot Zone, A Soldier on the Front Lines of Biological Warfare by Dr. Mark Kortepeter. And I'll link to it in the show notes, and it'll make a great Christmas gift if you have somebody in your family, your friends that like this kind of riveting, thrilling type of stories. And I want to thank you, Dr. Mark Kortepeter, for talking to me about the book today and these interesting topics, and congratulations on the book.
Great. Thank you, Robert.
You bet.